On May 29, 1919, at a remote island off the coast of West Africa, a British astronomer photographed a solar eclipse and, without meaning to, took the picture that broke the moral foundations of the Western world. That sounds like an overstatement. By the time this video is done, it won't. Because what happened in the months after that photograph, what the newspapers said, what the public decided it meant, and what a generation of intellectuals built on top of that misreading, is the most consequential chain of intellectual cause and consequence in modern history. It connects a physics result to the Gulag. It connects an eclipse photograph to Auschwitz. And it connects both of those to what your grandchildren are being taught in school right now. Paul Johnson understood this chain. He documented it in detail in what is probably the most important work of popular history written in the 20th century. And once you've seen his argument, once you can see the mechanism, you stop feeling like the world went mad without reason, and you start seeing something far more useful, a pattern. One that has a beginning, a middle, and, if history is any guide, an end. Let's start at the beginning. Arthur Eddington traveled to the island of Principe with a team of astronomers to photograph a solar eclipse. The point was to test a prediction that Albert Einstein had made 4 years earlier, that gravity bends light, that a massive object like the sun would cause even a beam of light to curve as it passed. If the stars visible near the edges of the eclipse appeared in slightly different positions than they should, Einstein's theory of general relativity was confirmed. They took the photographs. They measured the positions. The stars had moved. Einstein was right. The confirmation arrived in London and New York in November of 1919, and the newspapers ran with it. Here is what the headlines should have said. Physicists' prediction confirmed. Space curves near massive objects. Here is what they actually said. That space and time were relative. That the old Newtonian universe, fixed and absolute, was gone. That nothing was what it seemed. That even the most fundamental categories of human experience were not permanent truths but perspectives. The Times of London announced a, quote, revolution in science. The New York Times described a new theory of the universe in which motion was relative to the frame of the observer. All of that was, in a narrow technical sense, true about the physics. The problem was what the popular imagination did next. If space and time are relative to the observer, the public decided, then perhaps everything is. Perhaps truth itself is relative to the observer. Perhaps good and evil are frames of reference, not facts. Perhaps morality is a perspective, not a principle. Einstein, by all documented accounts, was appalled. He would spend years trying to correct the misunderstanding, arguing explicitly that his physics said nothing whatsoever about the relativity of moral truth. The theory of relativity is about the physical relationship between objects and observers moving through space-time. It has no more to say about ethics than the boiling point of water does. But the misreading had already escaped. Paul Johnson opens Modern Times, his documented history of the world from the 1920s to the 1990s, with exactly this moment. He calls it the birth of a relativistic world, and he is precise about what that means. Not relativism as a philosophical position with serious arguments, but relativism as a cultural atmosphere. A feeling, spreading through the intellectual class of Europe and America, that the old anchors were gone, that there was no longer any viewpoint that was simply true regardless of who was observing. And then Johnson asks the question that the rest of the book spends 900 pages answering. What happens when a civilization loses the belief that some things are true regardless of who is observing them? The answer is not, as the optimists of 1920 assumed, that people become more tolerant, more flexible, more creative. That was the theory, that if you dissolved the old moral absolutes, you freed humanity from superstition and tyranny, and what you got on the other side was a kind of enlightened, experimental openness. The answer, as the record shows, is a vacuum. This is the central mechanism Johnson identifies, and it is worth spending a moment on it because it is not complicated, which is part of why it is so devastating. A society needs moral authority, not as a luxury or a comfort, but as a structural necessity, the same way a building needs load-bearing walls. You can redesign a building in all kinds of ways, but if you remove the load-bearing walls without replacing them with something else that carries the load, the building doesn't stand. Human communities are not different. They require some account of what is right and wrong, what is permitted and forbidden, what a person owes to others and what no one can take from a person without becoming something less than human. That account does not have to be religious. but it has to be grounded in something outside the preferences of whoever happens to be in power this week. Moral relativism does not free a society from the need for that grounding. It simply removes the grounding while the need remains. And that is what a vacuum is. What the 20th century discovered, at a cost of approximately 100 million lives, is that vacuums do not stay empty. They get filled. And what fills a moral vacuum is not, as the optimist hoped, a gentler and more tolerant version of whatever came before. What fills it is the strongest available substitute for the authority that was removed. In some countries, that was the state. In others, the race. In others, the class. The content differed. The structure did not. In every case, something stepped into the vacancy that moral absolutes had left. Something that claimed the same authority, demanded the same obedience, and punished the same dissent, while being answerable to nothing outside itself. Johnson is not making a theological argument here. He is making a historical one. The record shows this, and the record shows it with a specificity and a uniformity that is difficult to explain as coincidence. Consider what happened in Russia. Vladimir Lenin did not build the Soviet system on the ruins of old Russia by claiming that his preferences happened to align with objective truth. He built it on a specific philosophical claim that history itself moved toward communism, and that the Communist Party was the instrument of that movement. This is a very important structural move. Lenin is not saying, "I want this." He is saying, history demands this, and to resist it is to resist reality itself. What he is doing, in Johnson's framework, is filling the vacuum. He has replaced the old moral absolutes, rooted in Christianity, in natural law, in the accumulated tradition of what human beings owe each other, with a new absolute, historical inevitability, managed by those who understood it correctly. The moral authority has not disappeared. It has been relocated from something outside human will to something firmly within human control, specifically within the control of the vanguard who had been educated correctly enough to understand what history required. And because the authority is now located in that vanguard, any disagreement with the vanguard is not merely political opposition. It is ignorance of reality. It is, literally, being on the wrong side of history. Now, consider what happened in Germany. Hitler's philosophical move is structurally identical, even though the content is different in every particular. For Lenin, the new absolute was the class. For Hitler, it was the race. But in both cases, the move is the same. Take the vacancy left by the collapse of shared moral absolutes and fill it with a new absolute that is located not in anything transcendent, not in God, not in natural law, not in universal human dignity, but in a collective identity defined and managed by the new ruling class. Johnson, in modern times, is quite direct about this. These were not opposites, they were variants. Two different fillings of the same structural void. And this is why, to Johnson's eye, and now to ours, the fact that they fought each other is not evidence that they were moral alternatives. It is evidence of what happens when two vacuums compete for the same space. The most troubling thing the record shows is this. Neither system began by announcing itself as evil. Both began by announcing themselves as liberation, as the final escape from the arbitrary, hypocritical, and self-serving moral systems of the old order. They were, in their own self-understanding, the result of human beings finally being honest enough to look at power clearly, to strip away the comforting fictions, and to build something real. This is what moral relativism produces when it is taken seriously and organized. Not freedom, a new absolute, without any principle that limits it. Now, here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If the Nazi and Soviet catastrophes were the filling of a vacuum, and if that vacuum was created by the specific intellectual atmosphere of a post-1919 Western culture that had decided truth was relative to the observer, then what was supposed to prevent it from happening again? The answer that Western intellectuals gave after 1945 was essentially education, the right kind. The kind that would produce people critical of authority, suspicious of tradition, resistant to the false certainties that had produced fascism. A generation that had been taught to question. This sounds reasonable. It sounds, in fact, like exactly the lesson the century required. But there is a problem, and Johnson's framework identifies it precisely. If you train a generation to be critical of all moral authority, if the entire educational project is built on the premise that anyone who claims certainty is probably using that certainty to oppress someone, then you have not eliminated the vacuum. You have deepened it. And you have produced a generation with no principle that prevents it from filling the vacancy with something new, the moment a new certainty arrives that presents itself as liberation. In 1934, a group of German intellectuals who had been associated with the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt and who had fled Hitler's Germany for the obvious reason that Hitler's Germany was not a good place to be a Marxist intellectual, arrived in New York. They eventually settled at Columbia University. The Frankfurt School, as they came to be known, had a specific project. They wanted to understand how fascism had happened, how a modern, educated, technologically sophisticated society had produced Nazism. Their answer, worked out over the following decades, was that the problem was not too little critical thinking, but too little of the right kind. The traditional family, organized religion, national identity, the authority of institutions, these were the structures that had made ordinary people susceptible to authoritarian manipulation. The cure was to produce people who were systematically critical of all of these structures. This is, in documentary terms, the intellectual origin of what is now called critical theory. And through critical theory, of a broader cultural and educational project that, by the 1960s and 70s, had reached most of the humanities and social science departments of American universities. Herbert Marcuse, one of the Frankfurt School's most influential figures, made the structural move explicit in a 1965 essay called Repressive Tolerance. His argument, stated plainly, was this: in a society where power is already structured to favor certain groups, tolerating all speech equally is not neutral. It is, in practice, a way of protecting the powerful. True tolerance, liberating tolerance, requires being intolerant of the speech and practices that reinforce the existing structure of power. Read that slowly. What Marcuse has done is take the core move of moral relativism. There is no neutral standpoint. Every claim to truth is really a claim to power, and turned it into a license. If there is no objective standard by which speech can be evaluated, then the only relevant question is which speech serves liberation and which speech serves oppression. And the people who determine that are the people who have been educated to see power clearly. The vacuum has been filled again, not with the state or the race or the class, but with the correct ideological framework, managed by those educated enough to apply it. Now, before we go any further, I want to pause here, because if you've been tracking this argument, you've probably started connecting it to things you're watching happen in your own time. The language that has changed in your grandchildren's schools. The corporate training sessions that have a very specific vocabulary about who has power and who doesn't. The institutions that once spoke in the language of universal principles and now speak in the language of identity and oppression. The connection I'm drawing is the narrator's application. It is not something Johnson wrote about directly, because Johnson died in 2023 and did not live to write the full assessment of this decade. But the mechanism he documented, the structural move of filling a moral vacuum with a new absolute that is answerable only to itself, is visible in the record, and visible, I would argue, with increasing clarity in the institutions around us. This is not a conspiracy. That is the important thing to understand. It does not require a coordinated plan. Vacuums do not need organizers. They need only the removal of what was filling them and the presence of something else that wants to fill them. What the Frankfurt School's intellectual migration accomplished was not a plot. It was the introduction of a framework, a way of reading all social reality through the lens of power, into the institutions that train the people who run the country's schools, its media, its corporations, and its government. The framework spreads because it fills a need. If you live in a society that has taught you to be skeptical of all inherited moral authority, and you are also a person who feels the weight of genuine injustice in the world, which every serious person does, then a framework that promises to explain injustice precisely and completely, and that tells you that your willingness to accept it is the measure of your seriousness as a human being, is going to be compelling. Not because people are stupid, because the vacuum was already there. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that what I keep returning to is the same problem. The gap between seeing what is happening and having the language to name it precisely. I've been putting together a reference guide. I'm calling it the Civilizational Vocabulary. 40 terms drawn from Johnson's framework, each defined with a historical example and a one-sentence application to what is happening right now. Moral relativism, the utopian impulse, the secular religion, civilizational fragility. The 40 concepts that, once you have them, make the present legible in a way it wasn't before. It's in the link in the description. It's the translation guide I wish existed when I first opened Modern Times. Now we return to 1919. and to the man who started all of this without meaning to. Albert Einstein spent the last 3 decades of his life trying to correct a misunderstanding he had not caused. He gave interviews about it, he wrote about it. He was reportedly explicit, almost frustrated, that his work in physics had nothing whatsoever to say about the relativity of moral truth. The theory of relativity describes the relationship between physical measurements made by observers moving at different velocities or in different gravitational fields. It is extraordinarily precise, extraordinarily verified, and extraordinarily irrelevant to the question of whether it is wrong to kill children. And yet the misreading persisted. Not because people didn't have access to the correction. Einstein was one of the most famous people on Earth for 50 years and said this many times. It persisted because the misreading was useful. Because a generation of intellectuals had built their entire program on the atmosphere, the misreading created. And to acknowledge the correction was to acknowledge that the foundation of that program was, in the most literal sense, a confusion. This is the inversion the record offers. The relativists of the 20th century, the people who built their careers and their movements on the premise that there is no standpoint outside the observer, no truth that is not a product of power and perspective. They did not arrive at this position by honest philosophical inquiry that happened to converge on a depressing conclusion. They borrowed it from a physicist who explicitly denied that the borrowing was legitimate. And then they kept going. Past his denial, past his objections, past the clear statement that the physics supported no such inference, because the conclusion they needed was too convenient to abandon. Here is the self-refutation hidden inside relativism, and this is the thing Johnson's framework makes visible. The moment a relativist says your moral framework is just a product of your cultural position and your power, that is a claim the relativist believes to be objectively true. Not true from where they are standing. True. A fact about reality that applies to you regardless of whether you accept it or not. But if all truth is relative to the observer, then the claim all truth is relative to the observer is itself only true from where the relativist is standing. It cannot be binding on anyone who sees it differently. The relativist cannot hold this position consistently without destroying the very premise from which they are arguing. They need an exemption, one fixed point from which their own critical project can be launched. One claim that is just true, not relative, not a product of power. And that exemption is what their entire argument was designed to deny. Paul Johnson recognized this as the intellectual original sin of the 20th century. Not just a mistake in reasoning, but a motivated mistake. One that was adopted because it was useful, maintained because its consequences were convenient, and never corrected because the correction would have required an honesty the system had no incentive to produce. The vacuum that was created in 1919 was not an accident. It was a choice, made by people who knew, or should have known, what they were removing, and who decided that the liberation they expected on the other side was worth the risk of what might fill the space instead. This is where the history lands you, if you follow it honestly. Not at outrage, not at despair, at something more useful than either, a pattern you can name with a beginning you can date, and a mechanism you can see repeating. You are not the crazy one. The 3 a.m. question, whether you have simply failed to adapt, whether the world has moved and you have not, is answerable by the record. The record shows that what you are watching is not the natural forward motion of human progress. It is a specific philosophical error with a documented origin, with a documented mechanism, and with a documented history of what it produces when taken seriously and organized. Your moral intuitions, the ones your education and your faith and your life's experience built in you, are not the residue of ignorance. They are, as Johnson's 4,000-year survey of Western history suggests, something close to the opposite. They are the accumulated correction of a civilization that tried the alternative, documented what it produced, and built something different. That does not mean things are simple. Johnson never thought they were. The record shows that every generation that held the line on moral absolutes did so imperfectly, often hypocritically, sometimes at great cost. There is no golden age to which any of us can return. There is only the question of what tools you carry into the present. One of those tools is the knowledge that this has a mechanism, that a mechanism can be named, and that things which can be named can be argued with, resisted, and, given enough time and enough people who understand the pattern, replaced with something that actually works. The question the record leaves open, the one I think about when I close Johnson's books, is not whether civilization survives. Johnson thought it had survived everything, including the worst century in human history. The question is what you hand to the generation coming after you. Not what you leave behind materially, but what you leave behind as a framework, as a way of reading the world that is grounded in something more durable than whoever is loudest at the moment. Tell me what you'd hand a grandchild. One book, one idea, one conversation, before it's too late to have it, and why that one. I'll be reading every response.